We are in session 3 of the Epic of Eden, and you have now crossed part of the Great Barrier. You have conquered the barrier of culture that stands between us and them. And now it's time to take on some of the other aspects of that barrier. And these aspects are going to include the barrier of geography and the barrier of time. Now, not only are we getting past the barrier, but it's also time to start organizing. Remember, I promised you an organized closet? Well, what happens with history and geography when folks study the Old Testament is they are overwhelmed by detail. So my job is to take all of this overwhelming detail and distill it down into a few careful categories that you can use and reuse for the rest of your life as a student of the Bible. So that's what I'm up to during this session, and we're going to start off with geography. Now, I know that many people have had bad experiences with geography. Back in 7th, 8th grade, junior high school, they made you learn all those maps and you were traumatized. Well, I don't want to re-traumatize you, so I'm going to start off very gently. So here we are with your first image. This is a mall map of the world. Now, I have many students who are absolutely brilliant who have memorized the maps in the back of their Bible. They can tell you where the tribe of Gad had its inheritance, and they know that Naphtali was one of the northern territories. I find that fairly impressive. But if they were to lift the map of tribal allotments out of the back of their Bible and be required to place it on a map of the world, it wouldn't be pretty. So we're going to start off big and narrow in. And again, we're going to start off gently. So when I speak of a mall map and you take a look at this image, why do I call it a mall map? Well, I am one of those rare female human beings who despises the mall. Deep, visceral hatred of the mall. Don't want to go there, overwhelmed when I get there. So when I go, I need a little map to help me. And so I look for the major entryways where they have those cool little, pedestal maps that say you are here, and Sears, where you have to go return the Land's End clearance items that you bought for your children online, is over here. And I look for that map, and that's how I navigate. So that's what you're looking at, is your map of the world, and find yourself on the map. You are here. They were there. And the little green slug that you're looking at is where all of biblical history happened. And that little green slug is much more affectionately known as the Fertile Crescent. So we're going to focus in. This next image is the Fertile Crescent. And I'm going to test your intellectual capacity here as you look at this screen. This area, this region of the world was called the Fertile Crescent because it was fertile and shaped like a crescent. Oh, you all are brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So this region, again, is where all of biblical history happened. Everything that takes place from Genesis through David to Joseph and back again, it all takes place in this region known as the Fertile Crescent. Now, why was it fertile? This region of the world is actually known for being desert and arid and inhabitable, but what transforms wilderness and desert into agricultural land and pasturage is water. And so we're interested in the 4 great river systems that shaped this region of the world. The first one is the Tigris River. The second is the Euphrates River. The third is the Jordan, and the fourth is the Nile. Now, these river systems transformed arid territory into habitable land, so people came and inhabited it. And when they did, they built their civilizations and their cities, and the great story of which we are a part. So again, when folks look at geography and they start reading all of those places in the biblical text, their eyes glaze over, they get totally lost in the details. I'm going to distill this down to a few regions that you can hang on to that will shape the story for you. So the way I'm going to do this is we're going to take this great region and we're going to speak of 3 areas. The first area is Mesopotamia. I love that word. Don't you love that word? It's just fun to say. Would you like to say it with me? Are you ready? Mesopotamia. Isn't that fun? It's like spatula or macadamia nut. Do you remember that skit? Have you seen that skit? Okay, so one more time. Mesopotamia. Great. It means the land between the two rivers. Meso means between, potamus means river. Hippopotamus means river horse, so you can hear potamos in there. All right, Mesopotamia is where the Bible is birthed. It's where the story begins. This is the first great region. The second one is the land of Egypt. Not as much fun to say, but an important region all the same. So Egypt is the next great area. What is interesting about these two regions is this is where civilization truly was born. If we were doing a Western Civ class or a world history class, I would spend all of my time in Mesopotamia and Egypt. These guys developed urban centers, mathematics, science, medicine, astrology, all of this stuff, astronomy, not astrology, all of this stuff before Abraham was a twinkle in his daddy's eye. These are the superpowers. These are the great civilizations. This is where the pyramids are. These are the people who developed writing. Our people, on the other hand, are kind of East kneecap hillbillies, all right? But we love them. And it is where our story begins. So these two regions are critical. They have all the wealth, they have all the resources, they have the great river systems, but in between them lies a critical land bridge. A land bridge that without it, these two great civilizations could never have communicated. And that region is where these arrows fall on your map. And this region is known as either Canaan, Israel, or Palestine. They're all the same place. The only distinction is that when the Canaanites lived there, they called it Canaan. When the Israelites lived there, they called it Israel. And when the Babylonians were unable to decipher the word Philistine, it was renamed Palestine. Don't you love that the land is actually named for the Philistines? It just seems like an historical irony to me. But all three of those names indicate the same place. I'll be using all three names throughout the series. Canaan is its oldest name, Israel is the next, and then Palestine. What's critical to us is the role of this land bridge, because the land bridge itself made it possible for Egypt and Mesopotamia to interact. And how would they interact? They would interact by trade, for sure, but they would also interact by means of military assault and defense. What this region became was the great toll road of the ancient Near East, which means that our heroes were exposed to every innovation of the age and all sorts of wealth that came with those innovations. That's great, but they were also the land bridge between the two greatest armies on the planet. And so our guys became the buffer zone between the superpowers. In other words, Canaan, Israel, Palestine had the snot beaten out of them on a regular basis, as first Egypt claimed them as a buffer zone against Mesopotamia, and then Mesopotamia claimed them as a buffer zone against Egypt. But at this critical crossroads is where God chose to manifest himself in real space and time to real people and to begin to tell the story. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at this map and we're going to tell the story and walk you through your great narrative in real space. So just kick back and relax and take a look at your screen. The story begins, of course, in the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden is described as a place in the east. So who's telling this story? Someone who lives to the west of Mesopotamia, right? A great garden in the east in which a cosmic river flowed that broke into 4 headwaters. And those 4 headwaters are named the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Pishon, and the Gihon. Well, you know about the Tigris and the Euphrates. You've seen them on the map. The Pishon is probably an extinct river that flowed through Saudi Arabia, and we'll get back to the Gihon. But all that to say that the biblical authors intend for you to see Eden in Mesopotamia. The next great story is going to be the story of Noah's Ark. And of course, Noah's Ark also takes place in the floodplain that happens in Mesopotamia. and the story of the great ark and the animals that are gathered. And here, God looks down at the race of humanity and says, even though the Adamic race has failed at every possible front, I'm not going to give up on the children of Adam. So he washes the world clean, he rescues a family and all of the creatures that had first populated Eden. They're rescued by means of an enormous boat which rides out the storm, and when it lands on Mount Ararat, repopulates the planet. This also happens in Mesopotamia. And then as the population grows and struggles with their new identity as a fallen race, we read about the Tower of Babel and how all humanity decided that they were going to try to conquer heaven. And God said, at this juncture, I think it would be wisest for me to confuse their languages and scatter them across the planet such that I can create some time and space for a redemptive plan. And so the nations scatter. We do not leave Mesopotamia, though, with the story of redemption until a certain man who, as far as we know, was born in Ur of the Chaldees, and his name is Abram. And of course, he is called out of Ur of the Chaldees, which, by the way, is a very real place. It's a real city. It is known for the resuscitation of ancient Sumerian culture. In fact, there's an entire era of history named after Ur, the Ur III period. And this civilization experiences collapse in just about 2000 BC, which also happens to be the opening of the Middle Bronze period, which is also where most scholars would place Abraham historically. So all that to say, these are not made-up places. But it's in Ur that Abraham receives his call, and how does he travel? He travels north, because how else could he travel? He can't cut across the desert unless he wants to die. So he follows the ancient highways up to a city that you've also heard of, the city of Haran. Also not a make-believe place, a center of Amorite worship. In the 3rd and 2nd millennia, the god Sin was worshipped there, and Amorite nomadic tribes had named it as a sacred center for their religious activity. This is where Abram's family first travels, and then he hears the call again and heads south into the land bridge that is Canaan. He will spend his entire life moving north and south between those two red brackets, from Dan to Beersheba, running along the central hill country as a nomadic herdsman, following seasonal pasturage. If you read the Bible casually, you might think that Abram is just wandering around, that he's lost. He's not wandering. What he is a very wealthy pastoralist who owns enormous flocks of sheep and goats, and he's following the pasturage. He's going north when rain is slight, and he's going south when rain is good, and moving his flocks in order to feed them and care for them. This is where the patriarchs will live out their lives, right here in the land bridge, in the land of Canaan. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12. This is their area of the world, until the youngest, Joseph, who we know well, irritates the snot out of his brothers, and they finally decide that it is time to get rid of the little brat. And so on the northern reaches of that little Levantine division up near Dotan, a very important east-west pass between the ancient highways that come out of Mesopotamia and the major highway that heads down into Egypt, Joseph is sold to a caravan. What's a caravan doing there? It's going to Egypt. It's going to Egypt to sell its goods and make money. And so Joseph is sold to the caravaneers, brought down to Egypt, and sold as a domestic servant in Potiphar's house. You know how the story continues, that although Joseph, there's Dotan on your map, by the way, he heads south into Egypt, and when he reaches Egypt, he will eventually settle his family in the land of Goshen. Goshen is what the Bible calls the eastern Nile Delta. So that when Jacob comes down after Joseph is finally rediscovered, the 70 souls and all that come down into Egypt, Pharaoh commands Joseph to settle them in Goshen, where the pastoralists are. And if we had weeks and weeks together, I would talk to you about this region of Egypt and how there's Semitic settlement all throughout the eastern Nile Delta in the era that we think the patriarchs date to. So in other words, Jacob and his kin are settling where the other Semites already are. Just like when the Chinese immigrated, they moved to Chinatown. When the Greeks immigrated, they moved to Lowell, Massachusetts. You might not have known that. And when the Cubans immigrate, they go to Miami and they find their relatives. This is how people immigrate. And so our fellows settle in the eastern Nile Delta. At first they are welcome guests, but eventually they become personas non grata. And they are marginalized, pressed to the outer edges of the society, and eventually are enslaved as a forced labor community within Egypt. And there they stay until Yahweh remembers his covenant with Abraham. He hears the cry of his people and he sends a deliverer. That deliverer's name, of course, is Moses. He challenges Pharaoh on his own turf. He proves to him that Yahweh is the Lord of the cosmos by turning Pharaoh's world upside down, and he marches the Israelites out of the eastern Nile Delta, through the eastern fortifications of Egypt, down to Sinai. At Sinai, they will camp for 1 year, and they will be transformed into the people of God. God will offer him their covenant. They will embrace it. They will hear the law. And at the 1 year mark, God will say, you've circled this mountain long enough. It's time to head north. And so under Moses' leadership, they will head north. They will come to the southern boundary of the promised land, and Moses will send in the 12 tribes. But 10 of them will look at those big Canaanites and say, oh no, God can't conquer Canaanites. And God will say, I just defeated Egypt. I just defeated Pharaoh. Were you there when I parted the Red Sea? Are your sandals still wet from walking through the ground level under the ocean? But they're like, oh no. And so the 10 spies give a bad report, and Israel is sent back into the wilderness. 40 years of wandering later, they finally get the call. After the generation has been purged, they come up through the Transjordanian area on the King's Highway, which is still there to this day. And finally, standing on the plains of Moab, Moses says, I am done. I resign. You can have this church. Thank you very much. It's been a good ride. Here's my associate. He is a young and handsome man. He will take over. I'm retiring. And so Joshua takes over. They head into the promised land, taking Jericho first, which happens to be right over the Jordan River from the plains of Moab, and our guys settle in the promised land. The first reality, the first manifestation of their settlement is the 12 tribes. And as you look at your screen, what you see is a map of that 12 tribe of settlement. All of our guys receive their patrimony, their parcel of land, and all the tribes move to their assigned area. They live as an independent, decentralized government for years. But finally, the corruption of the society is so great that it seems the only possible solution is a king. And so David is called. He becomes the king of Israel. He defines the territories of the kingdom. And for the first time in Israel's experience, from the arm of the Euphrates to the Wadi of Egypt, Israel owns its own land. And this is your story by means of geography. The last chapter of this story is when the kingdom divides north and south. We wind up with a civil war, northern kingdom versus southern kingdom, until God finally brings the covenant curse. The northern kingdom is sent off into exile because they failed to keep the covenant, and they head back to Assyria, and the southern kingdom is captured and heads back to Babylon. So that's your story. There's the big picture. Let's break it down to our 3 regions one more time. We got 3 regions we got to know, right? The first one is Mesopotamia. The second one is Egypt. And the third one is Canaan, Israel, Palestine. We're going to do that one more time. Okay, your first region is Mesopotamia. Your second one is Egypt. And your third is Canaan, Israel, Palestine. Okay, you've got geography. Let's take a look at real time, and this one will go quicker. All right, real time. Again, so many acquisitions in your closet, so much data that you've packed into your brain from third grade Sunday school all the way forward. How in the world are you ever going to use this? What I find over and over again with the folks I train, that they're afraid to preach the Old Testament because it's too complicated. How in the world am I going to get all those dates and people together? Well, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take all those dates and those people, and we're going to start organizing your closet. So what you're looking at right now is Sandy Richter's handy dandy timeline. I designed it, I've edited it, it's yours, reproduce it at will. This timeline tracks the story of Israel. Actually, it tracks the story of redemption from Eden all the way to the New Jerusalem. It tells the entire biblical story from beginning to end. And so we're going to start off here in this story with Eden, just as we did in geography. And Eden is this first icon, the tree on the upper left-hand corner. Now notice, by the way, that I have no dates under Eden. I have question marks. And the reason for that is we can't date Eden. Now there are a lot of folks out there who think they can date Eden, and they do it by means of work that was done by Bishop Ussher in the 16th century. Now Bishop Ussher was a fine scholar and a fine churchman, but the way he came up with his date for Eden, for the creation of this planet, was by means of adding up the genealogical ages in Genesis. And once he added up those ages, and he complemented them by the parts of the Bible that we are clear on actual dating of the events, and did the comparative work aligning those dates, he came up with 4004 BC. In fact, he actually came up with the exact date of creation in October of 4004 BC. Now again, Ussher was a fine scholar and a fine man, but what he did not know is that genealogies are never intended to be exhaustive. They are like filing folders for people. And so people are placed in genealogies in different ways and fashions. In fact, if you were to compare the genealogies of Matthew chapter 1, for example, and the Gospel of Luke, you would find that in Matthew, there are 14 generations that divide Abraham from David, David to the exile, and the exile to the Christ. And the biblical writer makes a very big point of the fact that there are 14 generations. Well, if you go to the genealogy of Luke, you will find that Luke divides David from the exile and the exile to Jesus by 21 generations. So is Luke a bad historian, or is Matthew a bad historian? Or is Luke a liar and Matthew telling the truth, or is Matthew lying and Luke telling the truth? Folks, the news is that what Bishop Ussher could not know is that genealogies are very fluid and rarely complete. The idea is that you emphasize the characters that are critical to your story, and you sort of sidelines the ones who aren't. So in Genesis, the genealogies run on a 10-generational scheme to highlight the critical characters. And so Adam and Noah get that 10th spot in order to communicate how important they are. All that to say, we can't date creation, not by the Bible, to 4004 BC. We can't be sure exactly when it occurred. It occurred at the beginning of all things, and it is the foundation of our faith. But exactly when, we're going to have to leave that to science to figure out. All right, so Eden cannot be dated, but this is our first great event. Here, God creates humanity. He places him in the garden with everything that humanity could ever ask for, and promises him unending relationship if humanity will simply obey. As you know, humanity chooses not to obey and rebels instead and says, no, I would prefer to make my own world, thank you very much. And God says, have at it. And so the fall occurs. The Adamic race develops and declines and becomes corrupt until we come to the second great benchmark, the story of Noah, where God cleanses the planet and reinstitutes relationship with one family, one man, Noah. Noah's family moves forward and develops and expands until in Genesis 11 we are introduced to one descendant of Noah, a fine man named Abraham. Abraham hears the promise, hears the call, leaves his Beit Av, his father's house, and heads off into a land not known. Whenever I hear that story of Abraham, I think about the fact that when I was 18, and God would call and say, go and leave everything and go somewhere you've never seen before, my whole response would be yes, yes, yes. But at 45, not so much, not so much. But Abraham, he's in that category. What he's being called to leave is a house that's paid for, a 401k that's full to bursting, relationships and networks and a job that he's worked for 25, 30 years, and yet he goes. And this is the great call. So Abraham and the patriarchs are the next big juncture on our timeline, and notice that I've started adding dates. And the dates here are approximate, somewhere around 2000. Now don't be thinking that Abraham stepped out of Ur of the Chaldees on October 27th, 2000 BC. It's not nearly that specific, but somewhere in that era is a great historical milieu for the patriarchs. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Joseph sailed down into Egypt, and then the great deliverance by Moses. The great deliverance by Moses is going to be our fourth benchmark, when somewhere around 1400, 1300 BCE, the Israelites step out of Egypt into their new life. As we follow the story along, we go through the era of the judges and the decentralized tribal government until at last Israel is called into the monarchy. First Saul, then David, then Solomon. These are the kings of the united monarchy, and that's our next great benchmark, is David. But many people don't realize that civil war actually occurred right after Solomon's death. Israel was a united monarchy only for 3 short reigns: Saul, David, and Solomon. And then Solomon's son Rehoboam, a little indulged, probably a little spoiled, didn't know what the average person was living with, put so much pressure on the tribes that the northern tribes said, to heck with it, we are done with you southerners. And the northern tribes headed north and the southern tribes headed south, never to reunite again. And so the divided monarchy begins. So as you look at your timeline, this juncture where the crown is the juncture where the north and the south divide. The first king of the northern kingdom is a God-ordained king. His name is Jeroboam, and he is given the northern kingdom, but he's given it under the condition that he will be faithful to the covenant that God established with his people. Well, the northern tribes are not faithful. They are syncretists, in other words, blending of their religion with Baalism from the very beginning. And so by 722 BC, Yahweh says, I've had it. There's nothing more I can do. I've disciplined you in every possible way. The covenant curse is enacted, and the northern kingdom is dragged off into exile. Thus ends the northern kingdom. In fact, you've heard of the 10 lost tribes. These are them. They are the 10 lost tribes. They never come home again. They disappear into the Assyrian hinterland. They're absorbed. We never see them on the pages of history again. The southern kingdom, on the other hand, starts with Rehoboam I, and everything you know about Israelite religion actually happens in the south. Jerusalem, the temple, most of the writing of the Bible, the priesthood, all of these things are happening in the south. And here the Davidic kings will rule. And so all of David's sons live or reign upon the thrones of the southern kingdom. But two, the southern kingdom can't keep faith. They have a few high points: Hezekiah's reform, Josiah's reform, but outside of that, it's a mixed bag. And so by the time we get to 586 BC, Yahweh says, I've had it, that's enough. I've done everything I can. Isaiah chapter 1, I've disciplined you from head to foot. I've beaten you. I've sent my prophets. I've sent famine. You will not listen. You will not hear. And so the southern kingdom is dragged off into exile as well. The difference is that the southern kingdom is the remnant. You might have thought that was a New Testament word. It's an Old Testament word. And the remnant stays faithful in exile. And in 538 BC, because of the Edict of Cyrus, an international event that Israel had no part in causing, but Yahweh uses as an instrument of his plan, Cyrus, the king of Persia, says to the Jews, if you want to go home,